Over time, anime discourse has evolved significantly. As anime becomes more mainstream, more voices are joining the conversation, especially when it comes to problematic anime. Ooh, spooky word. And while this broader discussion has its positives, there are still some trends that concern me about where these conversations might be headed in the future. Two videos in particular, on Love Lab's blackface and discussing problematic media, and the anime pervert and the danger of normalization, perfectly illustrate the rhetorical impulses I fear will dominate anime discourse moving forward. And I know what you might be thinking. Well, what are these impulses? Well, let's find out. Starting with the Love Lab video. The video begins reasonably well, offering context for the blackface scene in Love Lab, this being presented as a response to a tweet that stripped the scene of its original context. While the awkward point about homosexuality sounds weird and out of place, it's not a major issue. The real problems arise when Mr. Dwarf rejects the idea that this, yes that, could be blackface at all. Uh-oh. So, he argues that blackface has a specific historical context rooted in the late 1800s and early 1900s America, where white entertainers portrayed black characters in a way that perpetuated harmful stereotypes and controlled the representation of an oppressed group. According to Dwarf, this historical context is crucial because it differentiates actual blackface from Maki's misguided imitation.
Blackface isn't just non-black individuals putting on makeup, it's a symbol of a dominant race controlling the representation of the marginalized, something completely different if the context is changed.
He then argues that Maki's actions stem from ignorance rather than malice, and suggests that her portrayal attempts to capture a more positive image of black performers rather than mock them. Yeah, there are a lot of problems with this. The historical context of blackface, while relevant, does not solely define the practice, as Google, Merriam-Webster, and Wikipedia's definitions all emphasize that blackface involves imitating or mimicking the appearance of black individuals, which is literally what Maki was doing. This focus on imitation highlights that the act itself is central to the definition, regardless of the specific historical context it originated from. This suggests that even modern portrayals that involve darkening one's skin, like Maki's, can be viewed through the lens of blackface because they embody the fundamental act of imitation, which is the key component of the practice. Even if Maki's intent is not to ridicule, her actions still resonate with the historical implications of blackface, as her getting smacked across the fucking head would imply. The imitation of soul singing immediately after makes this even more apparent. And yes, while it's not the blackface racial caricatures of the 18 and 1900s, it doesn't fucking need to be, because it's still engaging in a form of stereotyping, something that isn't even challenged by any of the characters in the scene, by the way.
A skin-deep observation is just that, and trying to equate the dated practices of a society with actual centuries of slavery and oppression in their history to stupid girls who are punished for being stupid in a culture far removed from that history really just undermines and ignores what it really is that needs to be remembered.
Yeah, because people attempting to call out something for what it literally is just people making shallow comparisons. Bruh, she engaged in blackface. End of story. Attempting to downplay it by shifting focus away from the act itself while claiming that the cultural context in which the actions occurred must align with the specific historical origins for it to qualify is a little dishonest. It just makes the final parts of his argument feel all the more dismissive.
Is the emotional response wrong? No. Even if the similarity is shallow, it's still going to be emotionally evocative of the problematic elements even if there's no connection. It's understandable to be put off because of it, but it doesn't become wrong because of the knee-jerk negative responses. No piece of media can be sensitive to every person or even culture. Media has the right to offend.
Look, I don't really care if this scene was problematic or not, but the people who might think it is have a lot more legs to stand on than you make it seem. It's just kind of infuriating when you make those people out to be irrational when they have every right to be as antsy as they are, considering the context of what we just went through. But that's not even the main thing that pisses me off about his response, Because the whole media has the right to offend and media can't be sensitive to every person or culture shit is, yes, technically true. But that doesn't suddenly give it the excuse to recklessly engage with sensitive topics while disregarding the potential reactions to the marginalized. I don't think Craftsdwarf thinks that should be the case, but considering the context of this conversation, this rhetoric can easily be used in support of that idea. An idea that does nothing but dismiss and silence the voices of people who might have valid concerns. This is a pretty bad start to the video, but trust me, it only gets worse when he starts talking about these two videos, because the flaws that were present in the Love Lab section are exacerbated in this section. First, starting with Zarya's video.
Zarya claims that this portrayal could cause real harm, insisting that Krone will somehow cause people to view others negatively based on what her character evokes. Not only does she fail to offer any citations to such a claim, but in the video she even points out a number of other black characters in anime, other portrayals that run counter to Krone's depiction, and prevent this one character from creating a holistic view of her race.
This is a complete mischaracterization of Zarya's argument. Zarya explicitly frames the harm of Sister Krone's betrayal as subtle and systematic, not as something that will instantly reshape someone's entire perception of black people. That's ridiculous.
In this case, the show is harmful in that it reproduces common stereotypes about black women, subtly warping their images to those outside the group, and calling to mind often traumatic experiences to those inside of it.
By using the word subtly, Zarya highlights that the harm isn't overt or easily measurable, but accumulates over time, influencing societal perceptions in ways that might not be immediately obvious. This is a critical distinction that Craftsdwarf ignores when he reframes her argument as a claim of direct causality. Zarya's critique rests on historical and cultural analysis, which explains how stereotypes like Sister Krone's perpetuate broader societal biases and invoke personal trauma. Her argument is not about direct cause and effect, but about the subtle, cumulative reinforcement of harmful ideas through media. Hell, the fact that a character like Krone was even created after characters like Yoruichi and Killer Bee demonstrates that harmful stereotypes persist despite progress in representation. This aligns with Zarya's argument that problematic imagery, even when unintentional, contributes to the ongoing cultural perception of blackness in ways that cannot be ignored. Positive portrayals might broaden representation, but they don't necessarily prevent harmful portrayals from being created or their stereotypes from being perpetuated. Instead, both coexist, shaping societal perceptions in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. By misinterpreting Zarya's actual argument, the essence of Craftsdwarf's response is effectively broken, leaving no real progress being made in the discussion. This misstep becomes even more glaring when we move to his critique of Under the Scope's video, where the dishonesty in Craftsdwarf's approach is far more apparent.
The Under the Scope video is even more baffling through its contradictory points. There's no universal moral code, yet Monogatari's presentation apparently has real-world implications that are a matter of public safety, actively endangering people by existing.
This critique rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of Under the Scope's argument. The statement about there being no universal moral code comes from a broader discussion about the dangers of demanding morally pure art.
A call for morally pure art is bound to yield a sanitized product. There's not some universal moral code. There is a lot of gray area with some things. So the only way people will create fiction devoid of anything someone finds problematic is if we completely avoid such topics at all. A total refusal to examine or challenge the status quo in a way that helps nobody and is itself, well, problematic.
This context is critical, as it underscores that the statement about moral codes is not meant to dismiss critique of media, but rather to caution against stifling art's complexity. By omitting this, Craftsdwarf falsely positions Under the Scope as holding two mutually exclusive views, that there is no universal moral code and that media can still have problematic implications. In other words, it's a straw man. Additionally, Craftsdwarf's assertion that Scope ever claimed this is false. Not only does Scope never make such a sweeping statement about Monogatari, but Craftsdwarf also removes context, turning a general observation about problematic media into an accusation against a specific work.
But what if I don't want to engage with these perceived real-world implications? I just want to have a good time. That's fine, but bear in mind others may not have the same luxury. For them, these real-world implications could be a matter of safety. Don't derail these conversations when others have it.
Here, Scope is clearly discussing problematic media as a whole, and how certain implications might affect people differently. Scope's point was about respecting discussions around media and its implications, and wasn't in any way singling Monogatari out. Furthermore, the actively endangering people by existing part is completely fabricated. First, he says could be a matter of safety, making it clear that he's referring to potential scenarios and is not making definitive claims or calling any work directly harmful. As you can see, Craftsdwarf's framing of Scope's argument is needlessly dramatic and inaccurate, framing it as an attack on Monogatari's existence, something he continues to express when he falsely accuses Scope of attacking the audience of Monogatari as well.
Oh yeah, and accusing his audience of having been unknowingly being given harmful beliefs about women because...
Take the treatment of female characters in so many harem anime.
like Monogatari.
It's naive to think nobody is going to watch that and internalize such attitudes. Not when they self-insert as MC-kun negging a bunch of schoolgirls.
Like people who watch Monogatari, who would be watching this video.
This reaction is, again, not only a straw man, but emotionally charged for no fucking reason. Scope is very deliberate with his language, carefully avoiding generalizations about the viewers of harem anime. He doesn't say that harem anime will turn its fans into misogynists, or you guys have been brainwashed into having harmful beliefs about women, or anything like that. Instead, he suggests that it's naive to think that nobody is going to internalize certain attitudes. This phrasing leaves room for variability among viewers and acknowledges that while not everyone will internalize these ideas, it's still a possibility that should be recognized. And that's a fair claim to make. Yet, Craftsdwarf overlooks this nuance to present Under the Scope's argument as an unreasonable attack on his audience. But again, it doesn't stop there.
The claim takes a presumed cause and extrapolates an imagined effect, with no evidence or meaningful link between the two, promoting the vilification of media and deflecting examination away from the actual attitudes and behaviors exhibited by people, instead shifting blame onto art that might reflect those behaviors.
Another straw man as a result of removing context? Yeah!
Take the treatment of female characters in so many harem anime. It's naive to think nobody is going to watch that and internalize such attitudes. Not when they self-insert as MC-kun negging a bunch of schoolgirls. Not when we see these same behaviors in reality. When we normalize these views in media, we send the message that it's acceptable.
The key phrase here is, not when we see these same behaviors in reality. This explicitly ties the behaviors depicted in media to real-world attitudes, showing that Under the Scope isn't claiming that media operates in a vacuum. Instead, he's arguing that media both reflects and reinforces harmful norms already present in society. Craftsdwarf makes it seem as though Under the Scope is accusing media of being the sole cause of harmful beliefs. Yet, Under the Scope directly acknowledges the reciprocal relationship between media and society. At the start of the video, he states,
Fiction is often a reflection of real-world experiences. It's one of the most powerful platforms available to examine ways of thinking and challenge systems. However, the reverse is true too. It can just as easily be used to perpetuate harmful ideas and attitudes.
Perpetuate, not create. This framing establishes that media doesn't create harmful beliefs in isolation, but plays a role in normalizing or challenging them. By the end of the video, Under the Scope reiterates this perspective by saying,
Let's sum it all up as clearly as I possibly can. Humans are flawed. Media made by humans is going to reflect those flaws.
He recognizes that media reflects the imperfections of the people and societies that create it. This clearly refutes Craftsdwarf's claim that Under the Scope is shifting blame solely onto media. All he is doing is pointing out a broader, systemic feedback loop between culture and media, urging viewers to critically engage with the content they consume. He is not, in any way, blaming media for the flaws present in society. Craftsdwarf claims that Scope's viewpoints run counter to actual studies and evidence, but he fundamentally doesn't understand any of Scope's claims, wildly misinterpreting them in ways that feel deliberate and desperate, making his appeals to authority come off as even more hollow.
His observations are at complete odds with the moe culture that's intrinsic and crucial to understanding the aesthetic of anime, one that rejects the real in favor of the unreal.
He claims that moe culture runs counter to Scope's observations, but he doesn't explain how. Like, how does this go against anything brought up in Scope's video? Do you think that just because a huge part of moe culture revolves around exaggeration and idealization, that it is completely unable to have any real-world implications at all, that it somehow exists in a vacuum and doesn't reflect anything that exists in reality, that it doesn't say anything about the culture it comes from, not even a little? Because if so, then fucking explain that! And if that wasn't what you were arguing, then don't say something is at odds with something just because it rejects direct realism and then not substantiate it. Art being a reflection of the society it comes from is literally the foundation of Under the Scope's video.
Fiction is a mirror through which we present an image of the world. We can distort the picture and lay a filter over it to create however many degrees of separation from reality we want. But when we create, we build on that original image of what we know in ways that speaks to our experiences, our understanding of people, and connection.
That perfectly applies to Moe. In what world does Moe culture undermine not only this idea, but anything else brought up in the video? To put it simply, it doesn't, and no amount of appeals to authority will say otherwise. The rest of the video is just him mouthing off about the importance of sources and having respect for the topics you cover, but it just screams nothing but unearned audacity.
But why is it necessary, as the lack of sources might imply, to refuse to hear out voices already contributing to the conversation with meaningful points and observations, in particular, those from the country of the media in question?
Yeah, because that's definitely what that means. Not linking sources to support claims you never made is totally you saying, fuck other people's voices in the conversation. Ugh. This video perfectly exemplifies the troubling trend in anime discourse that I see too often. A subset of fans shifting responsibility away from media while misrepresenting the arguments of those who seek to hold it accountable. When actually understanding the arguments that Zarya and Scope make, they clearly aren't advocating for censorship, nor are they suggesting that media brainwashes people. But you wouldn't know that from watching Craftsdwarf's video. His misrepresentations create a false narrative, one that distorts legitimate critiques into caricatures or exaggerated attacks. And this is my fear for the future of anime discourse, that shifting responsibility away from media, misrepresenting critics' arguments, and relying on emotional appeals over substance will become the norm. While this video exemplifies these trends, it isn't the only one that does this. Yep, that's right, the anime pervert video is next, and that video takes it to a whole nother level, going as far as accusing people who don't like sexual harassment of female characters in anime of being cultural imperialists. Yes, really. The basis of this video serves as a defense of the pervert trope in anime, using this article on the subject as his foundation. He claims that these characters provide an outlet for fantasies that cannot be acted upon in reality, with their perversion being bent towards comedy as a way to laugh at those attitudes. He argues that anime frames perversion as a state of immaturity and stagnation, portraying these characters as ultimately unable to progress towards their goals as a result of their childish perversity. However, this supposed general rule is contradicted not only by other examples from anime, but even the very characters he cites. Craftsdwarf argues that Mineta's perversion is portrayed as something he must overcome in order to achieve his goals. He highlights the final exams, where Mineta and Sero face off against Midnight. When Sero is kicked out early, Mineta is envious of the attention Midnight gives him, but instead of giving in to his desires, he chooses to focus on the test. By prioritizing his role as a hero over his perversion, Craftsdwarf claims that Mineta demonstrates personal growth, showing that maturity comes from advancing beyond childish perversity. However, this argument overlooks a key contradiction. Mineta's entire motivation for becoming a hero is because of his perversion. He wants to get girls. Failing the test by jumping into Midnight's lap wouldn't have helped him achieve that goal. So rather than growing beyond his immaturity, he's simply being pragmatic, understanding that there's a time and a place for that behavior. This isn't growth in the sense of outgrowing his perversion. It's just learning to strategically suppress it when necessary. Ironically, this example undercuts Craftsdwarf's argument that anime inherently portrays perversion as stagnation, as in this case, it's something the pervert can work around when needed. And that's not even mentioning other anime perverts. Take characters like Tomoki from Heaven's Lost Property, Meliodas from Seven Deadly Sins, and Rudy from Mushoku Tensei. These characters routinely engage in inappropriate and even predatory behavior towards their female peers throughout their stories. Despite this, they're still able to form meaningful, often romantic relationships with the very people they harass, never having to meaningfully address or change their behavior. Rather than being something that holds them back, that actively prevents them from forming relationships with these people, their behavior is ultimately ignored and treated as a part of their charm by the narrative. And then there's my boy Sanji. And well, this example is actually well argued by Craftsdwarf. However, it still falters when he brings Roshi into the equation at the end.
If he truly desires his audience to connect to Sanji, then on some level there may be growth. And if characters like him never get around to growing, well, hermits like Roshi are still alone for a reason.
This is a flawed comparison because we know almost nothing about Roshi's backstory, making it impossible to draw definitive conclusions about his status as a hermit. For all we know, he could have been a ladies' man in his prime or just didn't care for settling down. We don't know because it's not an idea that Dragon Ball explores. Yet Craftsdwarf wants us to believe that it's connected to this general idea of stagnation when it's something that's never called to attention in the series. This highlights the biggest flaw in his argument. He presents his interpretation as if it were an inherent function of the trope, rather than a charitable, narratively specific reading that can be applied selectively. Out of all the characters he brought up, only one really fits this idea, and one valid example most definitely doesn't justify passing this viewpoint off as a general observation. But hey, let's say that I'm wrong about everything, and this all somehow makes sense. It still doesn't address the core reason people dislike these characters. The real problem with the pervert trope isn't just that these characters are perverted, it's that their behavior is ultimately trivialized by the narrative through a lack of meaningful consequences. When these characters sexually harass or assault others, the narrative often glosses over the emotional and psychological toll this can have on their victims. Instead, it showcases a series of slapstick punishments that fail to portray how damaging these behaviors can be to others. Take Mineta, for example. He acts perverted, gets a slapstick punishment, and then it's wash, rinse, repeat. There's no real accountability, no genuine growth, and no meaningful exploration on how this consistent behavior makes the victims feel unsafe. It effectively sends the message that yes, this behavior is bad, but ultimately inconsequential. And that's what happens when you continue to let characters who we're supposed to like engage in this behavior and have it be brushed off so easily. And that's really why people dislike the anime pervert. His observation doesn't really address the core issue, and instead comes off as self-centered. He frames these characters' actions as a personal obstacle rather than something that negatively affects those around them. The most important issue isn't that they're hurting others, it's that they're supposedly stagnating themselves. And that just seems pretty shitty to me. Why is the focus on their stagnation instead of the harm they cause to people? It's just a really bad defense for the trope, in my opinion. The basis of Craftsdwarf's defense just doesn't work, and this becomes more apparent as we delve deeper into the video, as he attempts to figure out why perverts throw off Western viewers. And his answer is cultural differences, particularly in how bathing is viewed. Ah, goody!
Perverted behavior is not associated with the inner heart of sexual repression evoked through fantasy, but the sexual predator. Something creepy, unnerving, or dangerous.
He implies that Westerners primarily dislike these characters because they wrongly equate them to sexual predators due to cultural conditioning. But this completely misrepresents the real issue. The problem isn't cultural differences. It's that these characters engage in behavior that is actually fucking predatory. His argument hinges on the idea that because Japan has different social norms around bathing, the concept of peeping toms play into a fantasy tied to community closeness.
So, with this picture in mind, let us take a bathing scenario and add in the fictional, childish, pervy peeping tom. To Japan, it is an illegal act, but the fantasy is stimulated by a closeness in community. The connection between genders in the bath is a thinner line, be it the open walls allowing sound to travel, or outright removal of the line with mixed baths, and the slight possibility in turn fosters the sexual imagination.
But this is where his entire point collapses. If the act is still illegal in Japan, then even within Japanese culture, it is recognized as crossing a boundary. His own words show that the issue isn't just Western perception. Japanese law itself defines this as predatory behavior. And if that's the case, then Westerners viewing that as an instance of sexual predation is completely justified. Beyond that, this excuse only applies to one very specific scenario, bathhouse peeping. But anime pervert characters don't stop there. They grope, look up skirts, spy on girls, steal panties, etc. All of these actions are textbook traits of a sexual predator, and no amount of cultural context erases how invasive these actions are. But Craftsdwarf is acting like it does, while also ignoring that Japanese viewers can and do have the same negative reactions to these characters as Westerners do. It's all mind-boggling to me. He continues to argue his point by comparing it to Western fantasies, accusing them of hypocrisy.
If a Westerner balks at such illegal actions like peeking in the bath, well, student-teacher relationships aren't even illegal outside of age of consent, but they are still socially frowned upon given the inherent, uneven power dynamic, the teacher being an authority figure, requiring responsibility to be respected in that role. But if the West can indulge in its fantasies in the harmless environment of media, then Japan should have no problem doing the same.
This is a weak argument for two major reasons. For one, the same people who dislike anime perverts are usually the same people who would dislike student-teacher romances in Western media, so there's no point in attempting to assert hypocrisy. Two, just because we understand why problematic fantasies exist doesn't mean we have to accept them. Understanding the cultural context behind something doesn't erase its harmful implications. This isn't pornography. The bottom line, the dislike of anime perverts has nothing to do with cultural ignorance. It's just that the actions of these characters are literally predatory, and it's totally justified to call these characters what they are when their actions accurately fit the description. Another thing that confuses me about this argument is how he tries to act like the pervert trope is a completely foreign concept to the West, and is completely exclusive to Japan, even though Western media has its own share of pervert characters, with the criticism of the Japanese perverts being equally applicable to Western perverts. This highlights that the issue isn't exclusive to Japanese media, but rather a broader concern about how media trivializes predatory behavior for laughs or indulgence in fantasy. This leaves Craftsdwarf's framing of the issue as a West versus East dichotomy inaccurate. How are we going to pretend like this is a cultural phenomenon exclusive in Japan when it quite literally isn't? In actuality, this discussion is inherently a gendered one. I mean, you have a trope where male characters harass the women around them for laughs or indulgence in fantasy. Not to mention that this harassment is something that most women, especially Japanese women, have to deal with in real life. By its very nature, it inherently alienates female viewers by prioritizing male fantasies and desires over the discomfort and autonomy of women, which leads to a lot of the discomfort coming from female viewers. This is something Craftsdwarf completely ignores for some reason. This lack of perspective is the biggest flaw of Dwarf's argument, and it ends up being the core of the video's second half, as he frames the criticism of the trope as an instance of the West attempting to censor something it doesn't understand.
New media meeting with a culture not prepared to understand or accept this media does not lead to acceptance or willingness to understand, but fear and desire to censor and silence this vehicle for new conversation and comprehension. And Japanese media offered a perspective that, to the unprepared American, might be confusing and frightening. And rather than understanding, the initial desire is that it shouldn't present the matter at all. It's normalizing things that are bad, therefore it should not exist.
What new perspective? What new conversations? What the fuck are you talking about? People aren't trying to ban the trope just because they'd like to see less of it. And what is there to understand about this trope? As we've gone over earlier, your observation is not an inherent function of the trope. The framing feels super dishonest, but it doesn't stop there. This framing is also used as a way to downplay the influence media has on reality, while also trying to remove as much responsibility from it as possible. For example, Dwarf's entire argument about children mimicking media and parental responsibility comes off as forced, as it's irrelevant to this conversation. The point hinges on an assumption he makes without evidence. The article he references states,
"The main issue with the perverted male centers on how it spreads across the internet and makes some think such behavior is okay. I've run into male anime fans that think it's funny to look up women's dresses and other anime comedic behavior."
From this, Craftsdwarf assumes that the people being described are children, even though the article doesn't specify their ages. He even acknowledges this himself.
So, in effect, we have anime fans of unknown age, presumably young, mimicking what they see in fiction and attempting to recreate it in reality.
The key response here is presumably. He doesn't know if they're kids, but chooses to frame his response as if they are, which then leads into a long discussion about childhood imitation and learning and parental responsibility. This is a major issue because if these male anime fans are in fact teenagers or adults, then his entire argument about media not being responsible for raising children becomes irrelevant, as it's a point no one made.
Imitation is an inherent part of learning. You can see this fed into through children's toys that let children imitate cleaning, shopping, childcare, etc. However, the key thing to note in this relationship is that while imitation is an inherent part to learning, failing and overcoming that failure through practice is a part of the learning process as well.
His focus on imaginative play, toys, and children being children suggests that he's talking about very young kids, rather than the anime fans the article describes. If these male anime fans are teenagers or adults, then his entire argument falls apart, as it's no longer a question of childhood learning and guidance, but a discussion about how media perpetuates and normalizes sexually inappropriate behavior in older individuals. By making the presumably young assumption, Craftsdwarf sidesteps the actual concern raised in the article, that some anime fans believe sexual harassment is funny, and instead shifts the conversation to parental responsibility, a completely different and irrelevant issue. Then there's his arguments against normalization, which are just bad. His main argument hinges on the idea that media doesn't directly create harmful behaviors, which is fair, but he ends up taking it too far by acting as if media has zero responsibility in reinforcing or perpetuating those behaviors.
But as explored, normalization isn't the fault of the media. It's the fault of how it's perceived and acted on, often as a symptom of the culture enacting it. Normalization is a deflective attitude, blaming not the culture and those in it, but the piece of art or even artist for somehow having a power that it does not have, as study after study shows a meaningful lack of connection in media affecting reality.
So media somehow doesn't have the power to affect reality because it's not a simple case of monkey see, monkey do? Something that you literally contradict by saying,
Japan, West Germany, Sweden, and Denmark have all had reduced sex crime rates as a result of more prevalent sexual media, especially those crimes committed by juveniles, those who most need multiple perspectives.
oh, so I guess when media affects reality in a positive way, it's cool to give it credit. But as soon as we talk about the negative effects of media, it's suddenly the fault of the people and the culture it comes from. That does not make any fucking sense. But you know what? Let's unpack all this. Can media influence reality? And what do people mean by normalization? Well, have you ever heard of Birth of a Nation? The Birth of a Nation is a 1915 silent film directed by D.W. Griffith. It portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroic figures during the Reconstruction era, depicting them as valiant saviors of a post-war South ravaged by Northern carpetbaggers and freed black people. The film was an instant blockbuster and had a profound impact on American society. Its racially charged narrative glorified the KKK and vilified African Americans, reinforcing existing prejudices and contributing to the resurgence of the Klan. The film's popularity led to the KKK using it as a recruiting tool, significantly increasing their membership and influence. This example illustrates how media can reinforce and legitimize existing societal attitudes, leading to real-world consequences. While the film didn't directly cause individuals to become racist on its own, it amplified prevailing prejudices and provided a sense of legitimacy to racist ideologies, thereby contributing to the normalization of them within culture. In contrast, consider the perspective that
art reflects the culture it's from, and if one takes negative behavior from a perspective offered by art, it is not the fault of the art, but because family or culture around them is ill-equipped to handle that perspective, or is even accepting of it out of having not heard another point of view.
if we were to apply this logic, we'd have to pretend that Birth of a Nation had no role in the KKK's resurgence, that it was purely the fault of the society watching it, and that the film itself was just a passive reflection rather than an active reinforcement of those ideas. Which is fucking absurd. Media doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It both reflects and reinforces societal attitudes by its very nature. And when those attitudes are already harmful, media can further legitimize and perpetuate them. With this in mind, allow me to bring us back to the pervert trope. Much like how Birth of a Nation didn't create racism but reinforced existing racist beliefs, Pervert characters don't single-handedly make people sexually harass others, but they contribute to an environment where it is trivialized. Again, the problem isn't just that these characters engage in perverted behavior, it's that the narratives they exist in constantly fail to portray their actions as anything more than a joke, with the ultimate message it sends being, yes, this behavior is bad, but not bad enough to matter. This trivialization directly mirrors real-world attitudes towards sexual harassment in Japan. As the article, Cracking Japan's Systematic Sexual Abuse Culture, highlights, sexual violence is frequently downplayed. Until the 1990s, people referred to sexual harassment as a mere annoyance or nuisance, downplaying the abuse. More recently, people exclaim that saying no is also an expression of fondness. Such attitudes aren't just theoretical, they have real consequences. Japan has historically had one of the lowest reporting rates for sexual assault, not because it happens less often, but because survivors face immense systematic and social barriers when coming forward. Legal red tape makes it difficult to press charges, survivors are discouraged from speaking out for fear of harming social harmony, and even when cases do proceed, convictions are rare. In one infamous case, the survivor won a civil suit but saw no criminal justice because her rapist had political connections. As a result, many survivors stay silent, reinforcing the idea that sexual misconduct is something to be endured rather than fought against. And this, ultimately, is why the pervert trope is so insidious. It doesn't necessarily cause sexual harassment, but it plays into the same cultural framework that allows it to persist. By constantly treating harassment as a joke, it reinforces the idea that it's not that serious. When Mineta gropes one of his peers in My Hero Academia, he gets a slapstick punishment, but remains a part of the main cast, his behavior never truly condemned. When the 7 Deadly Sins Meliodas molests Elizabeth in her sleep, it's framed as charming. The same pattern repeats across countless other shows. These aren't isolated incidents. They are part of a larger trend that reflects and perpetuates the trivialization of sexual harassment. So when people talk about media normalizing bad behavior, they don't mean it in the cartoonish strawman way of monkey see, monkey do. They mean that media has the power to shape cultural attitudes, reinforcing ideas and behaviors that already exist. Just as the birth of a nation didn't create racism but provide it with a renewed sense of legitimacy, the anime pervert doesn't create sexual harassment but contributes to the perception that it's not that big of a deal. And in a society where survivors already struggle to be taken seriously, that perception matters. Dismissing this effect by saying that art is not responsible for how people interpret it is not only inaccurate, it's irresponsible. If we recognize the power media has to positively influence culture, as Craftsdwarf himself does when arguing that access to sexual media reduces sex crimes, then we must also acknowledge that media can have negative effects as well. You can't have it both ways. Either media influences culture, or it doesn't. Another big problem that I have with this video is the framing of Western critics as ignorant, irrational, and fearful corruptors of Japanese culture, when that simply isn't the case. He argues that Western interpretations of Japanese cultural practices, such as cosplay and maid cafes, often lack context and lead to corruption of the original intent. He cites differences in cosplay practices between Japan and the West, suggesting that Western approach leads to issues like sexual harassment due to misunderstanding of the culture.
Closer proximity and lack of familiarity with the concept and practice led to deviants indulging in their desires, in turn demanding conventions address the issue.
However, this perspective overlooks the fact that sexual harassment is still a problem in Japanese cosplay. For instance, at Comiket 96 in Tokyo, a Chinese cosplayer faced significant harassment, with attendees crowding around her, taking unsolicited photos, and invading her personal space. This incident highlights that despite being a more formal affair, sexual harassment still occurs in Japanese settings, indicating that the problem isn't due to Western misinterpretation and closer proximity, but a broader systemic issue. And regarding maid cafes, he references an event in Columbus, Ohio, arguing that the failure of this event was due to Western misunderstandings corrupting the concept.
However, the Joyo Maid Cafe event in Columbus, Ohio was nothing of the sort, employing middle school-aged and older girls in a context where neither party was prepared to engage in the proper fantasy space for such an establishment.
However, without specific details or sources, it's challenging to assess the validity of this claim. The lack of context makes it difficult to determine whether the issues he describes were due to cultural misinterpretation or other factors. Since he doesn't provide any sources, I couldn't verify his claims for myself. But given his track record so far, I have serious doubts that cultural misinterpretation was even the issue. This demonization of the West reaches its peak with the accusation of cultural imperialism. It's an absurd claim when you actually consider the real criticisms of the pervert trope. It effectively suggests that the people who take issue with the depictions of sexual harassment and assault are just trying to impose their values onto Japan simply because it's different. Which is not only ridiculous, but also kind of insulting to Japan.
It is a corrupting influence. Therefore, it is not the receiving culture that needs to understand those differences and gain new perspective, but the giving culture that should conform to the ideals and values of the dominant culture so as to not tempt said dominant culture with what it deems as deviant, even if it's as simple, childish, and innocent as a character getting aroused at the thought of seeing a naked and attractive member of the sex they happen to be allured to.
Do you see how dishonest that framing was? No one is claiming that the pervert trope is problematic simply because it depicts attraction. Get the fuck out of here. At the end of the day, this entire argument is built on a false premise, that criticizing one specific trope is somehow an attack on Japan itself. It's a ridiculous conclusion that relies on deflection rather than engaging with the real concerns being raised, and it's all just frustrating. And that's it. Just like his Love Lab video, this video exemplifies a troubling trend in anime discourse, shifting responsibility away from the media, misrepresenting the arguments of those who criticize it, extending as much charity as possible to Japan and its media while being as uncharitable to Western viewers. You know the deal. This pattern fosters a community built on misunderstanding, dismissal, and aggression, where legitimate criticism is reframed as ignorance or even cultural imperialism. It's not good. While discussions around anime have improved over the years, these same flawed arguments persist. Even now, 5 years later, Craftsdwarf has left updated comments on both videos, reaffirming the very points that misrepresent and distort the discussion. This unwillingness to engage honestly with criticism is exactly why I worry about the future of anime discourse. Because if this becomes the norm, meaningful conversations around anime will always be buried under bad faith arguments and cultural scapegoating, with no real progress being made. This was most definitely the case back in the 2010s, and honestly, I would die if it went back to that time. But that's all I got. See ya.